Good afternoon. I'm Michael Shifter, president of the Inter-American Dialogue, and I want to welcome all of you to a very important and timely session focused on the impact and implications of the COVID-19 outbreak on Peru. Today, Latin America is the epicenter of the global pandemic with over 100,000 deaths. Some experts believe that number could reach 400,000 by October. At the outset, it seemed like Peru was doing everything right in response to the pandemic. Peru implemented one of Latin America's first and strictest lockdowns, closed its borders, imposed a nighttime curfew, and unveiled a large stimulus package. President Martin Vizcarra was seen as a regional leader in dealing with this crisis. But Peru has become one of the world's worst hotspots for the coronavirus. After Brazil, Peru has the most COVID-19 cases in the region. As of today, there are over 280,000 confirmed cases and over 9,500 deaths due to COVID-19, only after Brazil and Mexico, the two most populous countries in Latin America. Many fear that those numbers, in fact, understate the true extent of the pandemic. Even with one of the largest economic stimulus packages in the region, job opportunities and income have vanished for many. Over 70% of the population works in the informal sector. The healthcare system and social protections for the most vulnerable in society are highly deficient. The latest IMF report estimates that Peru's economy, long regarded as one of Latin America's strongest performers, will shrink by some 14% this year. That compares to roughly 5% for the global economy and just over 9% for all of Latin America. Peru's contraction will be greater than that of Argentina and Mexico and also Brazil. Of course, the IMF sees a recovery of over 6% in 2020-21, recognizing its sound record of prudent economic management and robust growth. Lima, a city of migrants, saw a massive exodus as hundreds of thousands returned to their hometowns, desperate to flee the pandemic and the loss of income. The World Bank projects a possible increase in poverty levels in Peru of some 10 points by the end of the year. In addition, in a country with a serious problem of corruption, there have been multiple reports that officials pocketed money that was supposed to pay for aid or personal protective equipment. This afternoon, we're going to talk about where things stand today in Peru, where President Vizcarra is on the dilemma that many leaders are confronting and wrestling with between balancing public health and economic considerations. We'll also discuss the political and social implications of this pandemic and the changes that the Vizcarra government might want to pursue to deal with this growing crisis. Are there any lessons from other countries that we can learn and apply to the Peruvian case to prevent further suffering? And could this be a wake-up call for Peru to address institutional and social reforms that have long been delayed? Could there be a positive outcome in the end? The dialogue is very fortunate to have three first-rate and highly respected Peruvian experts who also happen to be good friends to share their thoughts for a discussion about COVID-19, what it means for Peru, both in the short and the longer term. Alberto Vergara is a professor of political science at the Universidad del Pacífico in Lima. He's a leading political analyst of Peru and also Latin American politics. Carolina Trivelli is a senior researcher at the Instituto de Estudios Peruanos. She's a former Minister of Development and Social Inclusion, writes a column for Comercio. And Lucia Damert is associate professor at the Universidad de Santiago de Chile. She has broad academic and policy experience on security issues, police reform, not only in Chile and Peru, but also Argentina, Mexico, and elsewhere. Today's session is part of a series of virtual events the dialogue is organizing on the wide-ranging effects of coronavirus in Latin America and the Caribbean. We hope you'll want to stay informed about these future sessions by opting into our outreach list on our website at thedialogue.org. We've also published a page dedicated to this issue on our website, thedialogue.org/COVID-19. that is updated daily with relevant and informed analyses regarding the impact of the coronavirus in the Americas. I've asked each of our speakers to give brief remarks for roughly 7 minutes, to be followed by a question and answer session. Participants can submit questions with the question and answer feature in Zoom, on Twitter using our hashtag COVID-19 and LATAM, or by emailing meetings@thedialogue.org. Before turning it over to Alberto, I want to just thank Irene Estefania for her superb and efficient coordination of this event, and also our summer intern, Casey Weatherby, for his very helpful background research. And with that, let me turn it over to Alberto to get us started.
Mike, thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to see you and to be at the dialogue, despite these circumstances. And of course, it's great to share the panel with Carolina and Lucia as other times. I would like to share these brief remarks, Mike, saying a couple of points, and I will not go back to something you said. It's this idea of how hit is the country, both in health, in terms of the pandemics, and in terms of the economics. I think you've done a great job summarizing that, and I would like to say that I think it is important to state that we're not in front of an economic crisis or a sanitary crisis. I mean, I think this is a major breakdown of the Peruvian social pact, a country that was already in sort of inertial decay for a long time, but has hit a moment, I would say, of national catastrophe. I'm not trying to say that we're worse than any other country, but I think it has revealed some very deep problems in the country that should be addressed, as you say, if there is a call to be able to solve those problems. And I would say, I would like to state two sort of problems, one related to what is happening in politics. I will, of course, focus on politics. What is happening right now, and what is going to be the context for the election in 2021. And I think right now, a problem we have in order to get into at least some sort of better situation for the election is that main actors right now in the middle of this crisis are acting from very short time. Their temporal horizon has shortened, has reduced, and they're all making decisions based on very short-term evaluations. So there is no mid or long term. They're all driven by this short term. And this put us in a sort of huge prisoner's dilemma that deepens the crisis by making choices that look to alleviate problems today, but make them bigger tomorrow. So in this moment, several actors are behaving from that perspective. And I think, for example, the Peruvian Congress has embraced a behavior driven by these short-term considerations. Every day is passing bills with no technical criteria against the basic functioning of the economy, decreeing measures that might be popular today, like frozen debts in the banks or frozen the payment of utilities, but that will generate a worse economic crisis in the future. And this, of course, is triggering clashes with the executive and the private sector. On the other hand, the private sector has shown, I think, these weeks, a greediness and aggressive rhetoric that will be difficult to erase from Peruvian memories. In recent weeks, the behavior of some private hospitals has been, I think, immoral, and it has been sad to see the private sector establishment supporting such behavior where private hospitals are charging to families that cannot find a bed in a state hospital, what they are charging is ruining so many families. So I think private sector, the Congress, and even the Congress and even the government in some decisions should stop seeing the crisis from this very short-term perspective and the choices that they are, and stop making those choices coming from that perspective, because this is putting us on the verge of a political crisis that we really don't need to add to our plate right now, right? However, these are not the only actors that can be moved by a crisis that shrinks those temporal horizons. The other key actor is our citizens, right? And this takes me to the electoral domain. My second point, in 2021, the electorate will have years for candidates promising to solve out these problems immediately from a traditional caudillista style, right? And unfortunately, as we know, these options also tend to govern from short-term political considerations that will not put the country in a new and better direction. So the main point I would like to share today is that in 2021, the country does not need just a new president, a new administration, or a new slogan. It requires a new horizon in order to attempt to rebuild the country. This time, we cannot count on an economy able to perform a piloto automático. The consensus of economic growth is no longer an option. We need a new consensus on what is progress, what is the kind of progress we want, and we have to build that project. But attempting to create a new consensus and policies and institutions that point out to progress is not basically an intellectual endeavor, it is a political task. And that requires several elements, right? In programmatic terms, it will require a project that reverses many of the business as usual premises of the Peruvian way of governing in these last years. It will require to give priority to public services, to public goods, fighting for a rule of law that can generate equal opportunities for all. It's no longer the time for the emprendedor dream or praying for the Copper International Prize. I think some sense of national fraternity also should be added to what we need. And my point is that if we want and we have this new horizon, that only can be done by unknotting several bottlenecks with social actors interested in keeping the status quo. But additionally, to this major programmatic challenge, it is mandatory in thinking to attempting this will require a broad platform that can have a foot in different arenas. For example, recent years show that aiming to the presidency without a strategy for having a strong group in parliament is tantamount to failure. PPK and currently Vizcarra demonstrate the huge mistake that implies to think that we can govern without the Congress. So we need a political coalition that can have a minimum presence in Congress, 30%, let's say, at least. However, because of our electoral system, that will not happen if you don't forge strong coalitions in Peruvian regions. The coalition has to reach the best available political elites in the regions in order to make that project doable. And as the recent results of Partido Morado show, it is quite difficult for partidos limeños to reach regions. So building such grand coalition that attempts to have the political leverage that would allow to truly reform the country is a huge task. And actors that could participate on that project should start right now to figure out already what can be done. It would be irresponsible if the candidates that can foster such change, and I'm thinking about 2 or 3 candidates and a couple of parties maybe, it would be irresponsible if they follow nothing but the well-known strategy of not doing anything, hoping to be the one that reaches the second round and then hopefully wins the election with the anti-vote. So to summarize, it is not time, I think, to think who's gonna win the election. It is time to start to think which is the broad and legitimate coalition that will be able to govern the country and put it in a new and better direction. Thank you, Mike.
Great. Thank you very much, Alberto. Very good. We'll turn to Carolina.
Hey, thank you, Mike. A pleasure to be with you this afternoon and with Alberto and Lucia, good friends of all of us. In terms of the social and as Alberto was saying, we are facing a major catastrophe. And this is not only because the economy is paying the bill to have this long-standing lockdown. It's not. we're paying a larger bill because we didn't do our job in the previous years. Actually, we are seeing now in terms of the social narrative a big change in how we read these past 15, 20 years of economic growth and poverty reduction and success in terms of being a country being able to manage a very sound macroeconomic and fiscal system, to reduce poverty, to have this growth that is considered pro-poor, and that we thought it was transforming the country, but actually it was transforming just a little bit the country and leaving us with several unsolved problems that are now in the top of the discussion, in the upper layer of every way in we can see the country. We are beginning to see the major recession in economics, in our economy that my generation have seen, and we've seen a couple, but for now, the IMF recently updated the estimates, and we are expecting a reduction in our GDP of about 14% for this year, and maybe more, because the risk to have a worse scenario is there, it's real. And that will bring us, as you were saying, an increase in poverty, an increase in vulnerability of most population, and will reduce the space and the market for this economic model in which being informal was the way to solve economic situation for each family. And what you need to do is to solve your own problems and move ahead without taking care of anything else. Institutions don't matter, rules don't matter. And having a state, on the other hand, a lot of people solving their own problems in any way they thought it was the best way to do it, without taking into consideration anything that was happening in the public's decision-making, in the planning of the government. And that led also to a very small government, a very small public sector compared to the other countries in the region, but also a very weak public sector with no capabilities to spend the increasingly growing amounts of money in the public sector, with no possibility to undertake a real fiscal, tax, or pension reform in the last 10 years, although we've been talking about that for several years, unable to enforce law or to regulate markets, or to, and more critical, to really get connected with citizens. The state, the Peruvian state, the Peruvian public sector in Peru has not real relationship, practical relationship, has not a connection with the citizen that was working in the market, in the informal sector, to sustain economic growth and to reduce poverty. Now, what we are seeing is states with very good intentions, with enough initial resources, money, to undertake very aggressive measures to respond to the economic crisis. But most of those instruments really don't reach the people, because the state is disconnected from the population. We put a lot of money in a program to provide liquidity to enterprises. And then we got surprised because only medium and large enterprises got that money. And we are unable to understand that the small and micro enterprises, which move the economy of millions of Peruvians, were not able to reach that money that was made available from the central bank and the public sector, because they didn't have any channel to get that money. They were not connected, nobody knew them. They were not able to ask for that help. In the same sense, we had a very early social protection response that was very interesting, very relevant in terms of the scale, the how early it was approved, but then putting all that money to move through delivering food and cash transfers to almost every 3/4 of the households in the country, but it was impossible to really deliver that money. It was impossible to really get that money in the hands of the people to allow them to pay their bills, to buy food. Why? Because our system, our payment systems, our financial inclusion is so weak that people began to be able to access the cash transfer, had to make very long lines, exposing themselves to health problems. And it's not because they did it wrongly, it's because the infrastructure of the country, the financial sector infrastructure was really insufficient to help for that. So what we are seeing is that we are paying the bill of all the things we didn't address before. We have a highly informal country, a highly unequal country, and most of the measures to solve, to help people and to help the economy to move ahead are based on that all Peruvians can get access to those benefits in the same way, which is not true, and that all citizens and all enterprises will be able to engage with all these measures. And that is also not true because of informality. Our weak institutionality, the weakness of our public sector really is now on top of the discussion. And that is something that is not very attractive to be addressed by politicians, especially with the short-term view and all the incentives that they have now in this very pre-electoral context. So very complicated situation, and we will face more difficulties in the months to come. And then we will need to begin solving them in very creative ways, I think.
Great. Thank you, Carolina. That was great. Let's turn to Lucia.
Thank you, Mike, Carolina, and Alberto. I couldn't agree more with you guys. I think that Peru is actually having a fourfold crisis. And I think that at one level, this is a regime crisis altogether. And I agree with Alberto, the social contract has to be revisited because this is a social contract that includes a few and leaves most of Peruvians, playing around in other spheres of life. Second, this is a political crisis. I mean, we have an electoral cycle that goes on and on without any real links or linkages to the societal, political, economical situations and changes that Peru is actually, living. Third, this is an institutional crisis, and Carolina described it very well. This is such a crisis. This is not the regular crisis that everyone is facing in the world. This is a crisis that is happening in a country that was the economic success of the last 2 decades. This is the country that has more money that they can spend. This is not a problem of lack of funding. This is a problem of social capacities of the state to implement policies. And it's really interesting how well designed are public policies and how badly or poorly implemented. So the divide, this gap between good planning and good decision making, and then nothing moving ahead on other provinces of Peru is really striking. And the fourth crisis is the technocratic elite crisis. This is a country that has been governed by perhaps 1,000 people throughout all political realm, that they've been implementing very good ideas, but now we are in this situation based on the fact that those ideas either didn't work, they were not implemented, or those people are really disconnected to the real situation of Peruvians. So that has a lot to do with the type of decentralization that we have in Peru, the type of political parties that we have. So it's really huge. It's not, the crisis in Peru is not like in Chile or other countries that perhaps it will last, 4 or 5 years and then we'll solve it. In Peru, I think there is a structural thing that has to be changed. And that goes direct to the topic that I'm most interested in touching upon today, which is, the criminal justice system, because Peru can really become a estado mafioso in 3 or 4 years, is perhaps one of the countries, besides those in Central America, and now the Caribbean because of money laundering, that is more open to this estado mafioso type of development because of this regime crisis, because of the increasing levels of corruption at the justice system, at the police system, and the military system. Also, because there is an increasing process of militarization that I think that has to be analyzed in more detail in Peru. The backbone of the government response to COVID-19 in Peru was the Ministry of Defense, which is interesting. It should have been social development, or I don't know, even the police, but the Minister of Defense is the one, in the front lines, along with the Minister of Health. So that tells you this authoritarian, hierarchical, highly centralized discourse that that I'm pretty sure will be center line of next elections discourse. So this is second, an area that I think that has to be taken into account. Third, corruption. I think corruption is in pandemic situation also in Peru, not only in Peru, but especially in Peru. And Lava Jato and all those, very well-known situations are just the tip of the iceberg. If you go all the way where not technocratic elites are located, but where regional movements, political parties at the regional levels are located and are actually developing their political forces, the linkages with illegal mining, with money laundering, narco trafficking, and all those criminal organizations are very obvious. And there is no political response to that. So in that sense, corruption, militarization, and the huge levels of impunity are opening the door for a very weak situation in which the state is not going to be able to build up their forces, unfortunately. But you will have a different state, a mafioso state, that will actually bring security to people, will charge you with some taxes. And as you will know, in Peru, extortion is growing really strong and at all levels, even sextortion for women, which is a very interesting case. And those levels of violence, unfortunately, I think will be linked to an increasing situation of chronic violence in Peru. Peru is not now a country with the highest levels of homicides. Unfortunately, all the analysis show that in Peru, we can expect to have more homicides, more kidnapping, an increasing presence of organized crime, increasing presence of regular criminality on the streets. And my main preoccupation and concern is how this insecurity context will impact on the electoral debate. We have a couple of front runners that are, Duterte style. So is that authoritarian, highly militaristic type of discourse the one who is going to get stronger in Peru? My sense is that that's probably the case. And that will not bring capacities for the technocratic elite or the political realm or the institutions to either change or to constitute a new social contract. On the contrary, if we don't really face those problems, we will have, increasing debates, increasing violence between different perspectives, and even social protest on the streets. So I'm really not optimistic. I think that President Vizcarra did what he thought was the best answer possible. But of course, the gap between La Plaza de Armas and then, Huancavelica or other places, or Lambayeque, when they have the higher number of deaths regarding to inhabitants, those are the situations that have to be tackled now. Unfortunately, the more authoritarian anti-political discourse will be the key or the main element of the next couple of years in terms of discussions in Peru.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucia. Well, the questions are coming in, but if I could just ask each of you quickly one question, and then we'll go to the questions from the participants. Let me start with Alberto. Alberto, why, Lucia mentioned that President Vizcarra has done what he can from Plaza de Armas, but, the situation that the three of you are describing it sounds so serious, and the numbers are certainly very disturbing. And yet, my understanding is that he still has 65, 70% support. And so I'm wondering, why is that the case, and what does that say about Peruvians that they support a president that's going to, presiding over an economy that's going to shrink by 14% this year?
Yeah, that's a conundrum. And I would say some will disagree, of course, about my optimistic, positive views of the population. But I think the population is perfectly able to distinguish between the effort you're doing and the results and the outcomes. I think people know that this is a tsunami, and that our health system was a sort of saquitos de arena waiting for that big wave. And so I think not only Vizcarra, I mean, main ministers in the cabinet, they have a strong support from population. I don't think it's because population do not know that this is such a huge catastrophe. Actually, a recent poll showed that already 44% of Peruvians know personally someone that has died from coronavirus. So we're talking about huge numbers in terms of how fatally it has been. So my answer would be that citizens can understand and distinguish between the effort of the president and its ministers than the results that I suppose us in a similar way that us, we know that something similar would have happened with any other government in power.
Okay.
Or worse.
Or worse.
Thank you. Carolina, let me go to you if I can. I mean, you just to try to go a little bit deeper on this sort of institutional sort of crisis or long-term problem. I mean, you served in government, you were a minister. Is this something that is that people are conscious of, the people who are sort of make decisions? Is this something that they want to do, but they're unable to do it, or most of them don't care if the status quo stays as it is? I mean, to what extent is there a recognition that this is this lack of institutionality and the channels, as you put it, to reach the vulnerable populations is a major obstacle for sustainable progress in the country, or they just, they recognize it, but they don't really know what to do about it? What would you say?
Based on my experience, I would say that when you are in one of those positions, you just work in the margin. You just move ahead, trying to improve whatever you've got, because you will have very short-term to do it. So you have to do the best you can in the conditions you get. So I don't think that there is a major discussion, actually, because we don't have this social contract aiming to solve these more structural issues. We are only working and managing the day-to-day business, and I think that is something critical. Most of the reforms that were that tried to become a reform were not really able to move because of political problems, or because of implementation problems, or especially because of the impossibility to organize a reform that requires really medium-term implementations. If you want to make a reform that goes beyond one government, that's almost impossible, actually, to make that reform because of this highly unstable political situation. And with our electoral system, it's very difficult to get this continuity. So I would say that we live in the last 20 years, we have this sensation that we have, as Lucia was saying, we have money. So we could do things in the margin. The going deeper was something that I think most of us found very difficult to move, because there is no really political discussion on the social contract, on the structure, on diversity, on decentralization. We try to improve decentralization, yeah, but if it's wrongly done, badly designed, well, we will stay there for sure. I think we have several problems tying all these things together: informality, weak institutionality, very complicated political party system, absence of political parties, this electoral system where you choose people, not ideas. All that together led you to this very short-term agenda.
Thank you. Lucia, a question for you on the corruption issue that you talked about quite a bit. People looking from the outside often ask me, in Peru, you've had, Fujimori, who's served a prison sentence for 25-year prison sentence. You've had ex-presidents, that have also paid a cost for corruption. And so, the conventional view was you tackle corruption by showing that there's a cost to corruption. And you've seen the people at the highest levels pays that cost. And yet you think that hasn't had any impact or effect on levels of corruption in Peru. If anything, it seems to suggest that it's gotten worse. How come that hasn't worked? I mean, for putting high-level people in jail and prosecuting them and having them pay a cost?
Well, my sense is that when you lose power, then you go to jail. But while you have power, then impunity is the name of the game. And that's why Alan Garcia killed himself, because finally he lost some political and some real power. But for how many years we actually discuss huge levels of corruption of Alan Garcia, his inner circle, his family, the whole party. I mean, there is a long list of mythological, topics in Peru regarding corruption of everyone. But in fact, since the political picture, the political scenario is so weak, as soon as PPK, got lost in the middle of nowhere, because he actually lost power of important groups, the private sector, no one, as Alberto said, no one on the Congress that will support you, then you're on your own. And then, his wife moved to the US because they knew that they will go in jail, because most of the decisions are done in the border, because there are many decisions being taken by presidents and many others that are really, borderline illegal. So that happens also to some presidentes regionales. So that's one of the main incentives to be in power, that you are not going to be, judged, you are not going to go to jail. And that happens a lot. So this is not the sense that, we don't have a strong judicial system. Well, we don't have a strong judicial system, but it is a political system. That's for sure. And as soon as you get some, some face in some picture, picture of your face, then someone will look for you. Or perhaps if you have a strong, powerful, group or network, then they will not. And I think that as my friends were saying, Carolina and Alberto, I think that, for instance, in interior, in the topic of public security, there has no be reforms, because we change minister almost every 4 or 5 months in the last 10 years. Just one lasted more than 6 months. So of course, this is such a weakened state that police reform, which is highly needed in Peru, is not gonna get implemented because there is no political will. Because politicians, most of the time, are actually playing the power building game. Because if they get, if they lose power, then they will be in the judicial realm. And most of the people, and perhaps Carolina even know this, most of the people who went through the important adventure of being in public service, as soon as they move out, they have to face lots of judicial processes. Most of
5
them,
years. 5 years with processes.
Most
2 years
them,
in the cabinet, 5 years with processes.
See, so those are the incentives for regular people not to move into public service, because you know that then you will have a long process and they can basically prosecute you for anything. So of course, there is some people in jail, but most of those with corrupt practices are basically moving along.
Okay, thank you. We have lots of questions, so let me try to get to as many of them as we can. There's one directed to Alberto. Is this, you kind of alluded to this, what needs to happen in terms of the next government. But what do you think is the likelihood that leaders will take advantage of this terrible, dramatic situation that Peru is facing to make these kind of pending reforms? And if you were asked by any new coalition that seemed to be poised to take power next July, I guess, July 28th, and they asked you what would be your priorities, what would be the first step that you would suggest they take?
You want me to answer right now? Yeah.
Yes, please.
Okay.
I'm going to go one by one.
Likelihood, of course, I'm not very optimistic. I think it can be done, but it will require some sort of truly generous leadership that, because the problem is that, all these are incentives and sort of informal rules that have shaped Peruvian politics for years and years. And as Carolina was saying, I mean, we have a political system that is ruled by politicians attempting to reach the second round of elections and see if they're lucky and they got elected. So that's why I think the main responsibility for politicians would be to start right now to quit that way of doing things. That business as usual is what has driven to us right here. So the incentives and the rules are still there. And so I think what would need was some sort of truly generous national concern that put together, not I would say that all the leaders, but at least two or three that can say, okay, man, you will be the candidate, I will put people in Congress, and you will be the canciller, something like that, you know, and then reaching for new people. I think something that Lucia said, it's absolutely important. This new legitimate coalition needs to bring back the good professionals to the public sector. I mean, a very harmful legacy of the years of PPK and Fujimorismo in Congress was that good professionals saw what happens to good professionals in the Congress and how they're treated and how the government did not defend them. And so, of course, no one wants to get back to the public sector to be humiliated by. So I think that's why I think the main objective in this moment would be to start to think some sort of coalition that if you win would allow you to change some things. Otherwise, I think it's not going to happen. Even if someone that you like and we can like different people win the election. I mean, if he wins with 18 congressmen, we're in the same situation, and you will not have any leverage to change things. So that's why I'm kind of obsessive these days with the idea that we have to start to think about this, the conditions, the political conditions that will make change possible. And this is not something that is only related to elections, but to what precedes the elections.
Right, thank you. Carolina, I don't know if you if you can answer this question, but somebody asked about, I think it's, if I remember correctly, there's some, what, 900,000 or so Venezuelans, migrants in Peru. And there's one question is whether they are beneficiaries of any social assistance program, whether any support, you know, and what is the current policy with regard to the Venezuelan migrants in Peru?
Yeah, I don't have exact figures, but there is like 1 million Venezuelans in
Right.
Peru, and they were not able to receive the cash transfer program because you need an ID, and one of the things that shows that in this country you can do reforms is that every Peruvian has a national ID number that works, that has biometric identification, that it's really powerful. But in this case, that was the requirement to obtain the cash transfer. But they got some of the food allowance, and they got a lot of social support from private institutions. However, their situation is extremely weak because they were living day by day, working in the informal sector, mostly in the service industry, restaurants, deliveries, and some other sectors that were the sectors more hit with the lockdown. So they remain the day after with no money, with no security, and with very high uncertainty of what was coming the next week. So the rates of poverty increase among the Venezuelan community. I think they are rising more quicker than the rest of the Peruvian citizens. And that is something to really take into account, because they are a significant part of our workforce today in several sectors.
Great, thank you. Lucia, you and Alberto talked about a new social contract. There's a question here. I don't know whether you want to take this, but it's addressed to you, whether beyond focusing on state-society relations, where does nature or the environment fit in this analysis? Is this a factor as well in any kind of new social contract going forward? And you know, of course, many illicit activities, as mentioned here, like coca and mining, derive their assets from the forest. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I just want to mention that there are 7,000 Peruvians waiting on a list here in Chile to move back to Peru. So this situation of migration, it's the same everywhere, and that Peru has to be organized to receive also thousands of Peruvians that, you know, lived abroad for a while, and they will be forced to go back. And that's a huge topic. Of course, then, you know, environmental policies have to be in the forefront of all policies in this new social contract. It's not only in Peru, I mean, throughout the world. If we continue in this path towards pandemic, constant pandemic situations, this is not going to be, you know, the discussion is going to be survival. It's not going to be economic growth. So of course, being in Peru, very neoliberal country in which most of the economic discussions were, well, we have to enforce, you know, mining industry, even though there are some consequences on the, you know, on the Amazon River, and we don't have to do anything because, you know, that's the consequence of economic growth. That's really sad, because now we are paying the consequences of, you know, this lack of regulation of mining, for instance. So of course, in the bottom of the new social contract, not only our relationship with nature, but also the way that we in Peru built our cities. It's insane, the lack of planning, the lack of infrastructure, and the way that Lima has grown, as long as many other cities. So if we don't tackle those structural issues, you know, nothing will change, and we will be talking about this the next pandemic.
Thank you. Let me go back to Carolina, then I have a couple for Alberto. But Carolina, someone is asking about, have been any serious efforts to try to reduce the level of informality in Peru? And, you know, what steps have been taken, if necessary, what should be done to reduce the level of informality?
Well, actually, we've been discussing informality for decades, and the instruments in the hands of the public sector or the political discussion to really reduce informality proved to be completely inefficient. The only informality reductions we've seen in the country are small, and most of them related to economic growth. So, but in a very small elasticity. So we need to grow like for 100 years to reduce 10% our informality rate. So that's something that's not good enough to be used to reduce informality. I think, and this is a very personal view, I think that the problem is not with informality, is the way in which we define formality. We are thinking that to become formal is to become something completely different of what people really do or can do for a living. And we need to change our view. We need to, I work a lot in financial inclusion issues. And I think if we can move people away from using cash, that will be a powerful way to move to formality, because every payment could be registered, traced, and that is a way of de facto imposing formality. But when you go to the discussions about informality, you talk about, you know, if you really comply with labor regulations that are, as Lucia was saying, that are only useful for the formal sector. All the rest, the informal, the illegal sectors, don't comply with those rules. They don't care about them. So you will never put all that huge sector within the formal rules, as we are tackling that those are formal rules. We need to figure out what other ways of formal can we really address that is not having everybody in an 8-hour paid job with work security and with social security. That is something that is too far away from us. I think we need to be a lot more creative if we want to really address informality.
Great, thank you. Alberto, there's a question from a participant about to what extent do you see a risk that of the rise of either right-wing or left-wing populist in Peru next year?
Let me just quick note to add to what Carolina was saying on informality. That I think it's something that strikes me in Peru is how we usually see informality as something that is only about pores and about these people selling things in the streets. Informality goes much beyond that. It's a way of skipping permanently the state. And it's done by the big enterprises. It's done by the hospitals. It's done by, so I think we have to include in our views of informality that is a way of doing business in Peru. It's not only a thing of poor people selling stuff in the streets, right? Which is usually the image that people have. Going back to your question, Mike, I don't think Peru, we don't need any pandemic to be at risk of having any anti-system right-wing or left-wing guy emerging, right? It's been always there, but I would say that the pandemic increases the possibility of that because, I mean, being clear, next election is going to be about material issues, about security. Security means money for a lot of people that will be in bankruptcy, for people with dead people in families, with no jobs. So it's a sort of context that it's very favorable for that sort of candidate that can promise very concrete material stuff. And so I'm afraid it increases the chances of having one of those caudillo style guys that will promise those basic stuff. Having said that, I think there is room for another group of candidates or candidates that can gather the support of people that will know that in order to rebuild this, you need some midterm objectives, and that means institutions, and that means having some sort of go beyond what you beyond the material needs of today. So I think the chances have increased. Chances were always there, but also I would not be deterministic saying that. So we're done. We're destined to have a Bolsonaro. I don't think it's the case.
Right. And just finally, I just want to ask each of you just to for a closing comment and try to put Peru in a sort of all of you know about other countries and put it in a regional context. And someone could be listening to the three of your remarks and saying, yeah, you have very good points, but these points are also relevant in a number of other countries. That all you have to do is substitute the country. There's high informality in other countries, the corruption in other, all these issues. And so Peru is just, another case. So I wonder if you could just have a final reflection for each of you, just trying to put Peru, what are some perhaps ways that they are part of a pattern and what ways are they, could they be distinguished? I want to start with Lucia and then go to Carolina and Alberto. Lucia, you know a lot about Chile, especially.
Yeah, I think Peru is really important, not only because I'm Peruvian, but also I think that one of the things that Peruvians have learned, or at least I hope they learned in this situation, is that the state matters, that going to vote and vote for the worst person in the line matters, because at the end of the line, if there is no public health system, if there is no oxygen for people in Loreto, if there is no, public sector, then you will get consequences, you yourself. And for many years, Peruvians, they thought that they will, increase their situation by themselves, basically. And I'm pretty sure that, informality is a Peruvian way to name culture of illegality. And I agree with Carolina and Alberto, culture of illegality is transversal to whole society. So it's important what happened in Peru because of democratic values, because everyone will be in Latin America looking at other countries, and Peru is perhaps, one of those countries that many people will look upon because of the failures of the pandemic initiatives, of course. Secondly, it's important because of the culture of illegality. And third, it's important because of the Estado mafioso, because organized crime is transnational. So if Peru becomes, the center stage of criminal organizations linked to trata de personas, money laundering, traffic of migrants, drug trafficking, among others, then the importance to other countries, the lack of trust to cooperate with other public sectors in Peru or in Chile or in Argentina will be, growing. So I think that, the Peruvian case is really interesting. And my last point is that Peru also, as well as Chile, also defines the challenges or the dying situation of the neoliberal model. And what happens in Peru will be, study in terms of how the neoliberal economic model will be revisited or will change.
Thank you. Carolina.
Yeah, I will go with the initial words of Lucia, saying that I think that the Peruvian case, it's going to be relevant for other countries that we're beginning to discuss if their public sectors were too big, that their bureaucracy was too large, that they were spending too much in providing things to citizens without asking them for enough individual action. And I think that the Peruvian case now is showing the cost of having such a small state, such a small spending capacity, such a limited institutional outreach to the people. And I think that is something we need to provide the rest of the region to avoid them going in that same direction. Because we're going in the opposite one now, as Lucia was saying. We need to rethink what's the role of the state and how this state needs to be modified to address the minimum needs of citizens and how we could rebuild this narrative. I think that discussion will be highly relevant for the region. And the second thing is about democracy. Becoming a more, crime-associated election, or having these caudillos, highly populist, managing the country, will bring several threats to democracy. And we have a very young democracy, actually, so it's not time to do that, because we will endanger a lot of the situation of all our neighbors too.
Great, thank you. Alberto, you mentioned short-term thinking, but short-term thinking you hear almost in every country, including this one. A few blocks from where I live in Washington, people don't exactly think in the long term. So, what is more at stake in Peru, or how would you put it in a regional perspective?
Well, I would say two things. That first one is related to Washington, D.C. I remember from my years there how all the establishment in Washington was so happy with Peru. And I remember being invited to several meetings, and I was always this grumpy political scientist. He came with the idea that the state doesn't work, and again with the crisis of representation, and that, guys, your country is growing more than the other ones. And I remember a meeting with an IMF guy saying that Peru was the best thing ever, and that the good thing about Peru was that elections don't matter. That whoever wins, he keeps doing the same thing, and so it's super stable. And so my point is that in some way, Peru shows that it is a problem if in Washington they are praising some stuff that maybe are kind of working, but not that much. If what you are doing at the end of the day is to se me fue la palabra, they're pushing them to do the same stuff and praising them for doing that. And I think that's part of the thing. I mean, if you are a Peruvian minister and you go to Washington and every time you go, they say that you're doing the best thing that you can do, of course you return to Peru to do the same thing. And so I would say that in part is this. And the other thing that I think makes the Peruvian case not unique, but maybe a special trend there is the thing that many of other countries in Latin America before the pandemic were already in a crisis. We're already in a situation with, well, Lucia is in Chile, not to talk about Colombia, Bolivia, Venezuela, of course, but in Peru, the narrative about this successful case wasn't more shaker grounds than before, but spite, it was there. I think it's, so part of what is special in Peru is, I think, is that many people are realizing, we were not in a moving into be a developed country, or we were not super close to be a OECD country. So I think there is an additional level of depression that comes from realizing that that the distance between the official discourse and the reality was, the gap was wider than even expected. And I think that it's maybe particular to the Peruvian case more than to other countries.
Very good. Thank you. Listen, I want to thank Alberto, Carolina, Lucia for their excellent comments and for sharing their insights with us today and taking time from their busy schedules to engage in this, I think, very important conversation about Peru. I want to thank all of our participants who tuned in and submitted questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them. There were too many, but you can follow up with each of the speakers if you'd like. And we'll hope you'll join us at our next event of the COVID-19 series. Once again, be sure to visit our new webpage at thedialogue.org/COVID-19 for updates. And most important, please all stay well and healthy, and be sure to take good care of yourselves. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Mike.
Gracias.
Bye.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mike.